Okay, Sue, we'll get back to some responses during the presentation. We're going to get started. 7 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. This session is a collaboration between GBH Education and NCSS, the National Council for the Social Studies. I'm Carolyn Jacobs in the Education Department at GBH. We are recording, and we will send out the link to the recording and many other links in a follow-up email tomorrow. They will come out to you from Zoom and me towards the evening tomorrow. And that will go to everyone who registered, whether you're on the live stream or not. GBH is Boston's public media station. Similar to stations all across the country in your local areas. We are fortunate to be the oldest and the largest station in the network and the largest producer of programming that you see on public media stations around the country. Shows such as, actually their series, such as American Experience, very appropriate for social studies, Frontline, Masterpiece, Nova, lots of programs for kids, all originate at GBH Boston. In the education department, we produce and make available at no cost educational content and services for the equitable benefit of students, very young children, and adults. And we accomplish our mission in part by partnering with PBS on the management of PBS LearningMedia, which is a free platform for pre-K to 12 educators and students, covering all curriculum areas, thousands of digital resources featuring short clips, lesson plans, interactive activities, etc. And if you're not familiar with PBS LearningMedia, we hope that you explore the site. I'm going to introduce Ashante Horton, who is the events and education manager at NCSS, and she has a few words of welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so ecstatic to continue our collaborations with GBH. We did that last year, and we're going to continue that this year. So look forward to more programming coming up. So about NCSS, we are the largest professional association in the country that's solely devoted to social studies education. Our mission there is to advocate and build capacity for high quality social studies by providing leadership services and support for social studies educators and professionals. Now, NCSS is a membership organization. We do have a lot of cool benefits of being a part of NCSS, like our Summer Leadership Institute this year, and that is offered free for members. And as you can see, that it focuses on promoting social studies as a central component of preparing students for civic life. So I'm just dropping our address in the chat. So if you want to just learn more about NCSS and maybe the Summer Leadership Institute, great. And now we could continue on with everything. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you. And we're, NCSS is near and dear to us, our favorite conference to go to. And we hope that this year in DC, it will be in person. We're counting on it. Oh, excuse me, in Philly. It's in Philly this year.
Yes, it's in Philadelphia this year.
Yeah, I'm back a year when we had to miss it. Yeah, when it was virtual. Okay. All right. Our presenters tonight are all part of the social studies team at GBH Education, led by Sue Wilkins, the director. After teaching social studies for over 20 years, and just prior to coming to GBH in 2019, Sue was the director of education at the International Museum of World War II in Natick, Massachusetts. And while she was at the museum, GBH got to know her because we collaborated with the museum to develop the World War II collection of resources on PBS LearningMedia. And the title of that is Life During World War II, Using Artifacts to Understand History. We also have with us Lindsay, a curriculum specialist who taught social studies for 10 years before coming to GBH. Last year, she received her BA in history from Northwestern and her MA in history from Brown University. And finally, Alicia Butler has been teaching for 20 years also. And in addition to working at GBH, she continues to teach US history and African American studies at a high school in DC. She was recognized as the 2019 Gilder Lehrman National History Teacher of the Year. So we have a lot of expertise here tonight. There was a lot of interest in this session. We received over 100 questions on the registration form. Those questions have been shared with the presenters, and they've done some tweaking to their presentations. If your questions are not answered, we encourage you or invite you to put them into the chat. Angelica from the Education Department is in the chat monitoring it. She will be answering some questions related to links and operations and mechanics or things. And then the presenters will be responding to the chat as they can. And then we have reserved from approximately 8 to 8:15 an open Q&A. So if you would like to stay around for that, we'd love to continue the conversation. Feel free to take a picture of this slide, although Angelica will be putting links in the chat. The slide deck is shared. There is a resource document that has URLs to much of what you're going to see tonight, plus a lot more suggestions for resources and collections that are of interest to social studies teachers. And then there is a shared folder of handouts and lesson supports that the social studies team has put together that is a companion to the presentation tonight. So I encourage you to look at that. And then we will have a post-webinar survey. All right, I'm going to turn it over. I didn't explain the agenda, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory here. Sue is going to kick things off, and then we're going to go into lots of specific examples of images and modeling classroom strategies. Sue will come back on towards the end and introduce the new US history collection that will be fully launched at in the back to school season this year on LearningMedia, on PBS LearningMedia. And I'll have a few final remarks and announcements before we go into the Q&A. Okay, take it away, Sue.
I'm actually going to turn this over to Alicia.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy because this is going to be a great webinar because I did not start talking while I was on mute, and that is always a good sign. So good evening. Thank you for joining us. Today, our essential question is, how can we use the power in historical images to reveal multiple perspectives? So our plan and our hope and desire is in this webinar, participants will be introduced to a variety of strategies and resources to aid in student analysis of primary source images and to explore multiple perspectives. Next slide. All right, so basically what is a multiple perspectives approach before we even jump into the strategies? History is its interpretive, it's historical understanding. It requires recognizing this multiplicity of points of view in the past, which makes it important to speak out of a range of sources on any historical question rather than simply use those that are easiest to find. And that comes straight from the C3 framework for social studies state standards. So in the classroom, presenting students with multiple perspectives requires them to actually analyze, to interpret, and to synthesize evidence. In doing so, students must acknowledge that history results from interpretation, and there are additional ways of viewing the past other than simply one own's textbook. Next slide. So in this history classroom, analyzing multiple perspectives may mean looking at a narrative or a story that's often excluded from the traditional US history survey, or shining a light on a perspective or story that is known, but it's often overlooked or ignored. When analyzing historic images, we need to ask intentional questions about multiple perspectives. What perspectives are revealed in our primary sources? Who or what are we adding with a multiple perspective lens? How does adding multiple perspectives impact our understanding of US history? And more importantly, why is all this important? Next slide. So in this webinar, we want you to be able to walk away from tonight's session, and tomorrow morning, you will have a bank of strategies in your hand that you can literally use tomorrow morning. That's our goal. That's your desire. In this webinar, we're going to be giving you strategies, such as worksheets, visual analysis questions, classroom discussion questions and activities, short in-class writings, group work, as well as examples of the flipped classroom. Next slide. But before we dive into that, let's first just establish, what are we already doing as teachers? All right, what do we already do? And more importantly, how can we add a multiple perspective lens? Next slide. So I'd like to turn our attention for a brief moment at a runaway advertisement for an enslaved person. And I really enjoy using these because there's so much information that we can get from this one source, even though it's just a couple of lines. This source contains a wealth of information. You can dissect it, and it can tell us, what we know about the slave owner and the institution of slavery, and it helps us to contextualize the era. But what I love about these advertisements is that it also reveals a dearth of knowledge about Eliza and the experience of enslaved women. Our question tonight, though, are we actually giving her an opportunity to tell her story in our classrooms? So many of us out there in the crowd, we know we're using these runaway enslaved ads, but are we giving the person that's being advertised an opportunity to tell us their experience? Next slide. So here are some of the common questions that we usually ask, right? So what's the name of the enslaved person? After our students, read the article, what was the name of his or her owner? When did she run away? Where did she run away to? Sometimes you might even get a little fancy and ask, what literary persuasion does the author use to elicit help to capture her, right? Next slide. But the question is, how can we take that exact same image, right? That same resource, and how can we flip it, all right, to be able to use this image to allow us to learn more about Eliza and to give her the opportunity to tell our students about herself and what life was like for her in 19th century America. So taking that same slide, you can ask questions like, what did she look like? There is a description there. How old was she when she ran away? Was this her first or her second attempt? And was she alone? So these are basic, kind of first level questions, Bloom's taxonomy, but we can up it a little bit, right? The next thing we can do with the same information, we can ask her, what hardships or obstacles do you think she endured while on this run? What factors do you think assisted her while she was on this run? And then my favorite question, many women did not run away because of the desire to remain with their children, yet this was her second attempt, and she ran away with her 2 sons. What insight does this give us about her personality, the conditions in which she was enslaved, or her proximity to resources? So now what we're doing is we're shifting the focus not to her owner, but we're shifting the focus to Eliza and the type of woman she was, and what she actually had to endure and what she had to overcome in order to get freedom, not just for herself, but also for her children. Next slide. So how can we use iconic images to also highlight multiple perspectives? That's what we're going to show you in a couple of minutes. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, when we began, Sue had asked us to take a look at this very iconic image, right? And we asked the question, if you just joined us a little later, how are we effectively, basically, how do we use the picture in our classroom, and describe one strategy that we use with your students? So what I was doing when I didn't realize that I was actually on camera, I was looking through some of the past, the earlier statements that you all put in the chat. And I got so excited because some of these were really good ideas. So I wanted to highlight some of the answers that were put in the chat of how people actually use this very iconic image, right? So if I mispronounced your name, please forgive me, but I think it's Paula. Paula said she, introduces these images to her students, and she has them, try to, discuss what are the conditions, how harsh is it, right? Take a look at the fact that it's so cold. What does this tell you about perhaps their lack of resources? Maybe they don't have any food, really trying to get them to go back in time and experience what it was like for these sailors, right? I think it's Judy Freeman, She said, I divide it into categories. What do you see? Write that on the right. And then, on the left, what do you think it means? What do you think is going on? Stephanie Carlisle, she says, I use that. I love this idea, Stephanie. I loved all of them. This was really different. I hadn't seen this before, as a way for students to introduce themselves, right? So what she basically says is she'd have a student point to an image, a part of the image. And then while they do that, they tell us what they see and then tell us about themselves. Awesome. I like the fact that I think it's Danny Evans said, I have the students role play it out. What's going on in there. I have them role play it and act it out. I love that. Robert Wagner says, I have them do, the standard who, what, when, where, and why. Right. And then I also, I saw some people that said, I use the I think method. And then I also saw one that I think it was from Sarah, what do you notice and what do you wonder about it? Right. What do you think is going on? Love these ideas. Next slide. But I'd love for you to tell me, if you could, I'm going to give about maybe a couple seconds in the chat, what impression of the war and its participants would students have if this was the only image that we used? So if this was the only image, I'd love for you to think for a second. If this was the only image we use, and when you talk about the Revolutionary War, what impression of this alone do you think it would give students about the war in general? If you feel compelled or moved to throw your answers in the chat, that would be great. Love to hear from you all. Your previous messages and comments were amazing. I was taking notes, getting some ideas. I see that Sarah, she said that if this was the only image that I used, Sarah Murphy says she would think that perhaps their students would think that Americans were glorious, they were brave, they're heroic. Robin says perhaps only men contributed. And then I had Tanya, she says, perhaps they would say, I think this was Tanya, it's moving so quickly. All right, only white males fought. Brandy said they were very determined. Andrea, only Caucasians were involved, right? Of course, Ms. Carter says, hey, it was very chilly. All right, Richard, this is an example of the resiliency. Right? The people that were involved in this were very resilient. I'm seeing a lot of comments about, being only white men that participated. And I love, Jim Stickle says that George Washington was the GOAT. I love it. And then lastly, I'll wrap it up by saying Dakota, all right, she said that I would assume that my students would think that Americans were able to overcome all types of obstacles. I love it. All right, absolutely. Can we go to the next slide? But now I want to flip it. And I want to actually introduce to you a strategy that I always use in my classroom before I began the American Revolution. I put this picture on the screen and I asked my students, can you find the Black man in the picture? I know some of you, a few of you might be out there scratching your head like, a Black man, I've seen this image how many times? I've never seen a Black man in it, right? That's exactly what my students say. And I usually begin with this activity because I know I have a lot of students in my classroom that when we talk about the American Revolution, a lot of them shut down. A lot of them shut down and a lot of them aren't interested precisely because of some of the things that you all said in the chat. That a lot of times, particularly my students of color, when they see this, they think they're going to talk about an era in history where they are not represented and they are not involved. This is the power of images because this image tells a different story. Next slide. Ta-da, there he is. He was right there all along, close to George Washington's knee. All right. So we believe that the author that painted this was trying to portray a gentleman by the name of Prince Whipple, who was a real live enslaved Black man who actually served in the American Revolution, right? And I think that it's very telling because this same regiment actually was John Glover's Marblehead Mariners, and it was a heavily integrated regiment, all right? This was not just a regiment of white men. It was a regiment where you had Native Americans, you had Blacks as well as whites. And when I do that, I love to call this activity lifting the veil. Now, I got my students' attention and now they want to know more. Are we really going to talk about an era and a war where people of color were actually involved? Next slide. But what I'd love to also have you do is take a look at the same image. Can you now spot the woman that is in the picture? And she is there. Yes, Diane, she is in red. Go to the next slide. There she is. All right. There were women that were on Washington's ration list during the Revolutionary War, right? Once again, how many times have we seen this image? And they are right in front of us, but none of us, or some of us, excuse me, may not have noticed that, right? And like I said, this is kind of the purpose of this webinar. A lot of images that we've already seen can do the job for us by introducing multiple perspectives, but are we taking advantage of it? And do we have the strategies to really employ them effectively? Next slide. All right, so this really kind of solidifies what our why is. Like I said, both were right in the middle of the pictures. They were not hidden. We've seen it multiple times, but we've never seen him and her. And the reason is we can't really fault ourselves because we have not been trained, many of us have not been trained to look from multiple perspectives. Next slide. So what about the painter? Who was he and what was his goal? All right, it was a German-American artist, Emanuel Lutz. He painted this in 1851. He was so inspired by democratic ideals. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to evoke strong feelings of drama and heroism. And he wanted to inspire reform movements back in Europe when he returned. And I think that this is an important fact to tell our students, not just, introducing to the painting, but, who did it and what was their intention. Next slide. And my colleague, Lindsay, is going to take it away. And we're going to stay in the revolutionary period. And she is going to discuss other ways that we can reframe the familiar.
Thank you so much, Alicia. So going off of what Alicia has started in this, I put another image up on this screen. So as you are looking in the chat, please say what image has been depicted. Great. Everyone passes. It is the Boston Massacre. All right. So now I want you to take a minute to think about how you first encountered this image. Where did you first encounter it? How do you know what's happening? Why is this image familiar to you? So again, just take a second. Think about when you first encountered this image, Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, and how did you know exactly what it was? So we have textbooks. It's been in, Eva says it's been in my history textbook since I can remember. Junior high textbooks, I'm trying to keep up. Social studies textbooks, yes. Okay, this is fantastic. Some of you are first encountering it. Some of you are saying that you've used it to look at a piece of propaganda. And yes, that's a way that I've used it in my classroom too. Really interesting to see that many of you encountered this first in junior high or in middle school. A long time ago, or in children's books. This is really great. So yes, in fact, the historic engraving was created by the famous silversmith, Paul Revere. It is entitled The Bloody Massacre in King Street. And as you've all said in the chat, it is capturing the well-known event of the Boston Massacre, which happened on March 5th, 1770 in Boston, Massachusetts. Revere's engraving was based on an illustration created by Henry Pelham. Pelham was never credited nor paid for his work, even though Revere had it printed and reprinted several times. So before I delve a little bit more deeply into this image and the history of the engraving, I want to think about ways to rethink and reimagine how we use this in our classroom tonight. So to really do that, I want to take you through an activity that I would do with students. I've even done this with parents on back to school night so they can kind of experience what it's like to be back in the classroom. And I invite you to try to experience this image for the first time, for those of you who've encountered it several times before. So what I simply want you to do right now is write what you see in this image. Refrain, please, from giving any additional analysis or any kind of commentary. I just want you to simply look and write down what you see in the chat. Some ways that you can do this: you can start with what catches your eye first, and then expand your observation out in a clockwise direction. Or you can divide this up into kind of quadrants. You can start by observing in the top left corner, going to the top right corner, then the bottom right-hand corner, and finally the bottom left-hand corner. Whichever your method that you pick, stay consistent. If you would want to, grab a scrap of paper to write down some additional things in case you want to keep these notes for later, or just drop everything in the chat. But no detail to notice is too small. So keep looking again. Is there something unexpected that catches your eye? Something that you didn't notice right away? Maybe add that to the chat. And as you're looking and as you're writing, I'm seeing a lot of themes. I'm really excited to start exploring these to you. Is something new revealed to you? Is there something that you didn't see before, even though you've looked at this several times? All right, it looks like we have some great comments coming through. We've seen redcoats lined up, dark windows, smoke, blood in the street, writing on storefronts, dead colonists, townspeople, the dog. I mean, the dog just standing there is pretty fantastic. Noticing the moon, so getting an idea of the time of day, observations of churches, various buildings. Looking now to see the smoke that's billowing out that wasn't noticed before. British have weapons, or the British redcoats, I should say. Carol, that makes me laugh that your students always ask if the dog was hurt. I feel like that's what my students really cared about too. And then who is wearing what clothing? And really, we can kind of see that this is an act of aggression. So just to be really transparent, when I used to teach this image in my classroom, I always taught it as a piece of propaganda. I'm sure many of you who use this image do that as well. We really clearly see here that the soldiers are seen as the aggressors. We get the impression that the colonists are innocent patriots. Their blood is literally pouring over the streets of Boston. And this is usually what I used to have conversations with students about how Revere was such a masterful man who really codified the colonists against colonial rule through this really strong piece of visual depiction. So, but today's purposes, I want to draw everyone's attention to kind of different iterations or versions of the engraving that were in print. So could I have the next slide, please? So I want to point out that there were several versions of this engraving that went into circulation. Revere made several adaptations for this over time. For example, things that were pointed out to him later was at the time when the clock was wrong, so he went back and changed that. But what I want you to do is look at these two different versions quickly and see if you can see anything noticeably different between the two. So again, you've had these great observation skills. Yes, Lisa, he did steal it from Henry Pelham. Look, is there something? Great. Keep looking. Write down your thoughts in the chat. Write down your thoughts in the chat. So some of you have noticed that the coloration is different, but also two of you have pointed out that in the right-hand side, we have a Black man who is not there in the left version of the painting. So next slide, please. Yes, Crispus Attucks is prominent there. So the version that I pointed out to you on the right here, I've screenshot it so you can actually see actually accounts for Crispus Attucks. So Crispus Attucks is well known as the first person to be killed for the revolutionary cause. He was of African and Native American descent. Born enslaved in Framingham, Massachusetts, Attucks ran away when he was 27 years old. Part of what we know about his life came from a runaway slave advertisement placed 20 years before the Boston Massacre, describing Attucks as 6 feet, 2 inches high, short curly hair, his knees nearer together than common. Known for his skill with cattle, Attucks found work as a sailor, a whaler, and a rope maker, and he lived under the constant threat of being either captured or being impressed by the British Navy. As history teachers, we are all familiar with Crispus Attucks. We know pretty typically he captures at least half a sentence, if not a full sentence, in any US history textbook. It isn't that we don't know about him. Attucks has an incredible present historical record. On March 12th, 1770, the Boston Gazette and Country Journal gave a full account of what it described as the tragic affair on Monday night last, or the Boston Massacre. The newspaper recounts Attucks' death as follows. A mulatto man named Crispus Attucks, who was born in Framingham, but lately belonged to New Providence and was here in order to go for North Carolina, also killed instantly. 2 balls entered his breast, one of them in a special goring, the right lobe of the lung, and a great part of the liver, most horribly. In this graphic account, Attucks receives both a martyr's death and a marker of his identity. But with the Boston Massacre engraving so familiar to so many of us, it's seared in our brains. Do we really look for Attucks or notice him in the primary source? Are we aware of the various versions that Paul Revere printed, several of which show just a sea of white faces, and also leaves out any female eyewitnesses of the evening? Yes, there were 2 women, Jane Woodhouse and Elizabeth Avery, who saw what happened outside their windows and provided courtroom testimony in the famous trial. But do we know which engraving is in our textbook? I certainly didn't when I first started using this image. And so how do these differences change our understanding of the story we tell our students? Next slide, please. So in 1856, William L. Champney painted his version of the Boston Massacre. I'm going to give you a moment to look at it, to observe it, to see it. And as you look at this lithograph, which was created 4 years before the start of the Civil War, how does this image reframe the narrative? So feel free to add your ideas to the chat. Looking at this image in 1856, how does this reframe our side? It shows both sides fighting. It shows both sides using weapons. And it brings Crispus Attucks to the front and center of the scene. Fantastic. Next slide, please. So as we look now at these two pieces in conjunction, Champney's version on the left recenters Attucks, who we all know as the first casualty of the American Revolution, as the central figure. Like all primary sources, it's important to be mindful that they're a product of their time. Perhaps Champney, who was an illustrator from Boston, was making a broader call in support of abolitionism. But as we reframe the familiar, pairing these two images together can paint a fuller picture for our students and provide them with a stronger understanding of multiple perspectives in US history. Now, I'd like to turn it back to Alicia, who will take us through some more source analysis.
Thank you, Lindsay. Now I'd like to discuss, what about those images where you shouldn't have to look so hard for the presence and voices of different communities and groups? And this is the activity I like to call hidden in plain sight. Next slide. So I'd love for you all to take a look at this image. How many of us have actually seen this image? And more importantly, can you identify any of the men that are actually in this picture? Yes, so automatically I'm getting Dr. King, I'm getting President Johnson, the same answers over and over again. Definitely, these are the iconic individuals. All right, okay, got one person in there, thinks it's Afield Randolph. Definitely, Abernathy is there, absolutely, great. So what do we see? We're identifying predominantly men. This, if you're not familiar with the image, this is the 1965 signing of the Voter Rights Act. However, I got another question for you. Can we go to the next slide? Using the same image, can you identify any of the women that are there? More importantly, have you ever noticed that there are women in the picture? I think that's probably one of the most important questions. The next question I'd love to ask is, have you ever thought to actually question who they are if you did notice them and why they're there at such a monumental event? The point of this is that it's not that we didn't know who they were, right? I mean, it's hard to recognize everybody in a photograph or an historical image. But the most important, fact about this particular image is that so many of us have seen this over and over and over again, and we've never paid attention to the fact that they are actually there, right in plain view. Next slide. So who are they, right? In addition to Johnson, in addition to King, and in addition to Abernathy, which so many of you all picked up, which is so comforting, this photo also features 3 Black women. Patricia Roberts Harris, she was the 1963 co-chair of the National Women's Committee for Civil Rights, first Black woman appointed as a diplomat to a foreign country in 1965. You got Vivian Malone, who was one of the first Black students enrolled in the University of Alabama and later worked for the United States Justice Department. And then we can't forget, all right, my favorite, Zephyr Wright, a White House cook and personal chef whose experiences helped educate Johnson about the actual experiences of Blacks in America. Next slide. So let's talk about expanding the traditional narrative as well. Next slide. Are we giving everyone a voice, or are we being selective in our narratives? Keeping with the same time period, the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, there are just so many photographs. This is one of my favorite eras to teach because it's just so rich in images, right? But what I've noticed over the years, particularly working with teachers, is that are we using the faces of civil rights protesters that we show our students? Are we actually showing them a variety? Are we using the same people over and over again? Are we using people from the same age group, right? Are we using people from the same, perhaps, social class? Are we only showing students pictures of protesters outside of their age group? Next slide. I wanted to just bring your attention to a resource that we actually have on our site. And it's a resource that goes into the history of the girls of the Leesburg Stockade. These young women were just absolutely fascinating. And these are women that are all pretty much under the age of 16, but they were activists as well. And I love using this image because it really does show our students that so many of the people that were involved in this very iconic and important movement actually were from the same age group as themselves. And in some cases, we teach high school like me, a little younger. So what we like to do now is to show just a short clip of the video about the Leesburg girls, and we'll come back with some strategies you can use with it.
You can't even imagine what we went through.
But other than that, I think that's it.
I started at the age of 12. My first jail time was 3 days at the age of 12.
People in Americas and Sumter County has no idea what we went through because they didn't know. They did not know, and no one can talk about that stockade but these girls.
I knew that was back there.
Okay, can we go in?
Yes, ma'am, it's open.
Okay.
You going that way, you go in this way. Yeah. Okay.
We were going that way.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
In the city, it was during that time was a very violent civil rights movement that started, and we were protesting as children.
My grandmother started taking me to mass meetings out in the country, and going with her, I became very concerned about the issues, not being able to eat in restaurants, not being able to drink out of the same water fountain. Those type things were just injustices.
I was told about a mass meeting, and I asked, what is a mass meeting? It's a gathering of people. We're going to come together and we're going to talk about the situation that's going on right here in Sumter County, Americus, Georgia.
I attended mass meetings for over a year before I, went to jail.
And how old were you in 63?
I was 13.
On the day that I was arrested, we was marching at the Martin Theater. There was a white side at the Martin Theater, and there was a black side. They refused us of tickets to purchase. Evidently, the young lady who was selling the tickets must have called the police department. All of a sudden, we had a rush of policemen coming down to that area.
This wasn't here. It was old. The bathroom wasn't here. There was one toilet back here on the side, and then it was a dripping shower here. But this was our home.
I joined the demonstration over at Allen Chapel. When we got there, we knelt down and prayed in front of the police station. And when we knelt down and prayed, Chief Chambers came out and asked us to disperse, and we did not. So they herded us like cattle.
I thought we were going to jail in Americus. No, they sent us out of town to Dawson, Georgia.
Transfer truck, a 16-wheeler, waiting for us at the back of the jail. And they put us on that transfer truck, and we had to stand up all the way to Dawson.
But the moment they closed that back door, it was dark. We couldn't see one other in that truck.
This was our home. This was our home.
For 45 long days.
All right, thank you so much. I was looking in the chat and it seems as if a lot of you all really enjoyed the clip and are saying that you can't wait to use it. And some of you are teaching civil rights right now, and that's amazing. That's awesome. I'd love to give you a worksheet that you can actually use in conjunction with this video that will really help be a great activity for your students and really help to engage them as well. So I like to call this an anticipation guide. Some of you are familiar with it. What I usually tend to do is I create a series of statements about the video. And before the students even watch the video or read anything about the Leesburg Stock Aid Girls and their amazing story, I ask the students, just based upon the statements, do you think that it's true or do you think that it's false? All right. It looks like Nikki Vickers knows what I'm talking about, right? And then what I do is I, after they're done, we'll discuss it. And then on the same document, there's a part 2. I will allow them to watch the movie, the documentary, and it's great because it's only about 7 minutes, so it's not too terribly long, but it's just engaging enough to give them the information they need. Then after they're done, all right, watching it, I have them go back, take a look at the anticipation guide, look at those same comments, and then determine, do you now think that it's true or false now that you've seen the video? However, one of the ways I elevate it is I make sure that they have to extract some type of evidence from the actual film and documentary and jot that down to provide proof for why they came to the conclusion that they did. Like I said, this is a great tool that you can use. It's easy, it's quick, it's a great warm up. It could be used as an exit ticket, or you know what, it could even be used in the middle of your lesson. And Sue is going to take it away and provide us some more information.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Well, pairing images is another technique we wanted to share with you tonight that you can use to prompt your students to analyze multiple perspectives. So next slide. So with this first pairing, you might simply begin your lesson with this question: what's the relationship between these 2 images and what makes you think so? So let me invite this very active group to put their ideas in the chat. And while you're doing that, depending on the content you've already covered with students, you could also ask them to answer the who, what, when, and where for each photograph. Or you could come back to these questions after you've covered the content with students, maybe use them as part of an exit ticket. Boy, it's great to see how many of you are familiar with this. This is wonderful. So you're right, these are the same 3 Lakota boys who were forced to attend the Carlisle Indian boarding school. There are about 375 known boarding schools that were established in children, roughly from 1860 to 70. The school charged with introducing Native children to the quote unquote habits and arts of civilization, while forcing them to abandon traditional languages, cultures and practices. And I think these 2 images illustrate that pretty well. There's a very good article in The Atlantic titled "Death by Civilization," and we've provided this information in the resource folder for you. But the author of that article provides some really helpful historical context while conveying the lasting trauma the boarding school experience had on her mother and on their family. And you might already be familiar with the fact that there are a number of young adult novels and memoirs that are written by survivors of Indian boarding schools. One in particular is a memoir titled Pipestone: My Life in an Indian Boarding School. It's by Adam Eagle. And he later became the leader of the Indian takeover of Alcatraz Island in 1969. So I think that's an interesting connection. So both of those sources are in that resource packet for you. Next slide, please. This is a different kind of pairing, and it's a way to challenge students to answer the essential question, who emancipated the slaves? And I imagine that's a question that many of you address in your US history classes. The images represent 2 different answers to that question. On the left is the famous Thomas Ball statue dedicated in Washington, DC in 1876. And on the right is a painting from 1862 by the artist Eastman Johnson. Next slide, please. So the questions on the handout are ones that are intended to guide students. A lot of you had questions that you submitted about sort of scaffolding questions and how do you sort of slow students down and make sure that they're carefully analyzing. And I think these kinds of question guides really do that for students. It draws their attention to important features of the artwork that they might not otherwise notice. And again, this is in the resource folder. So Ball's statue suggests the more traditional narrative of Lincoln, the great emancipator who freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation and later victory in the Civil War. The statue shows Lincoln sort of bestowing freedom on the bowed man who is portrayed as a humbled and passive recipient. It's interesting, I think, that Frederick Douglass was the keynote speaker at the statue's dedication. We all know of that relationship between Lincoln and Douglass. But days later, Douglass sent a letter to the local newspaper criticizing the statue's design, specifically the enslaved man's posture on his knees and nearly nude. All right, next slide. So perhaps Douglass would have preferred this interpretation. The Johnson painting shows a very different perspective. It shows an enslaved family running away to a Union camp in search of freedom. By this time in the Civil War, enslaved people were deemed contraband, and therefore they could be seized by Union forces despite the fugitive slave law. This practice was introduced by Union General Butler and then solidified in the First and Second Confiscation Acts. Here in this painting, the story of emancipation is one led not by Lincoln, it's led by the enslaved people themselves. I mean, notice the absence of any white figures in this liberation. They're risking everything for freedom and compelling the Union Army and eventually Lincoln to take a more forceful position on the issue of emancipation. So asking students to make sense of these images and then to decide for themselves, which perspective they agree with. You'll notice that on both of those sheets, the last question is based on this image, who emancipated the slaves. But they might even come up with a wholly new interpretation that sort of combines the two. And I think this really just makes for a very interesting classroom activity and discussion. Great, so I'm going to turn things back over to Lindsay now.
Thank you, Sue. So what I want to do next is take you all through a gallery walk. I hope this activity inspires ways to use multiple images and media sources to really truly understand multiple perspectives. So what we're going to do tonight is look at a major historical event that we all know very well, the fight for women's suffrage. So this gallery walk, it can either be used as a multimedia presentation, or if you'd like a more traditional method, you could print out images, hang them on your classroom walls, and take students through stations. And this also, what I'm going to take you through tonight, complements many of the ready-made resources that we have on PBS Learning Media. And I hope that this gives you a much more nuanced and complex picture of a very familiar topic. Next slide, please. So as you look at the image on the screen, I invite you to all take a moment and use the chat to respond to the following question. When you think of women's suffrage, what comes to mind? So just the first idea off the top of your head. Don't spend too much time thinking about it, just your initial gut reaction. Susan B. Anthony? Mrs. Banks. Oh yes, I love that song. Hunger Strikes. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Seneca Falls, Women in White. Yes, well-behaved women seldom make history, from Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, one of my favorite quotes. And then thinking about the 19th Amendment, Alice Paul, Sojourner Truth. And then, yes, some people looking at the fact that the 19th Amendment was hard-earned. So next slide, please. So perhaps this is an image that comes to mind when you think about the fight for women's suffrage. I saw in the chat that a couple people had written about parades. So I want you to take a moment to look at this photograph. As we did with the earlier image on the Boston Massacre engravings, what do you see? And as you observe, I want you to reflect on the following. What perspective do we have of women's suffrage just if we use this image? So I invite you again to add these ideas into the chat. So observing the slides, essential question, how did women gain the right to vote? We're going to use this throughout our unit or our gallery walk rather. I hope it's a helpful, essential question for any unit you complete. So they're well-dressed, white middle class, only women marching. Their mothers, great. It's solidarity. It's peaceful, orderly. There's a kind of nice familiarity with it. And it's patriotic, right? They're waving flags. A perfect depiction of the hypocrisy of white women during the suffrage movement. Fantastic. It's small and they're patriotic. No, this is fantastic. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've given 3 different images. On the left, the front page of the March 4th, 1913 Washington Post. In the middle, a photograph of Lucy Burns after her arrest for protesting at the White House in 1917. And finally, on the right, a photograph of suffragist Mary Wilson. So as we seek to answer the question, how did women gain the right to vote? How do these images change that perspective? And feel free to add any ideas into the chat. How then does this build onto our understanding, these 3 images of how paid a high price? Thanks, Christy Claire. Civil disobedience, arrest activism, direct action. It had consequences. Willing to be jailed for their cause. It was more intense than we just see of those peaceful marches in the previous slide. And also looking at the headline, the woman in the photo looks like Statue of Liberty, very symbolic. I'll get to that in a minute. And their fight was resisted. Thank you, Dakota. I'm going to end on that note and continue on. So just a little bit of historical context for what you're seeing on the screen for the image of the Washington Post. On the afternoon of March 3rd, 1913, the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson's as the nation's 28th president, thousands of suffragettes gathered near the Garfield Monument in front of the US Capitol. The 1913 parade was a chance to introduce new activism into the suffrage movement. It led new energy, new tactics, and leadership to the languishing battle for the right to vote. It also garnered huge national attention that was both planned for and some of it was unexpected. So the plan for the day included 2 major events. One was going to be a parade. The other was going to be a fantastic allegorical pageant. It was going to begin on the plaza in front of the Treasury Department, 14 blocks away from the inauguration. By the time the head of the parade reached the Treasury steps, the pageant would be coming to its glorious dramatic finale, where everyone would proceed to the Continental Hall, and there the pageant cast would perform the final tableau again for a triumphant crowd. This had been the brainchild of Alice Paul, who we all know well. No detail had been overlooked by Paul. She made sure of it. Well, I'm only going to have time to share a little bit of the parts, the events of the day. Other things that happened that day was mob hostility and controversy about how to handle African-American marchers. Paul succeeded in her mission. She upstaged the inauguration of the president, and she took part of the front page of the newspaper from him. This pageant and parade ushered in more militant tactics, which you've already observed from your chat comments, and these would become commonplace for suffragists over the next several years, including their arrests. So with just a few more historical facts and details to support these visual images again, I ask you to think a little bit more and reflect on how these images and the context can help you answer our essential question. Think with your students how this would change your initial thoughts. Again, it's important to remember that these are still just a few images representing a larger movement that happened over several years. So we're going to keep going on our gallery walk. So next slide, please. And to help us to continue to examine our essential question, I want to turn to this brief video montage, which opens one of our PBS Learning Media resources that will be available to you after this presentation. Thank you so much. So in just this brief minute reel clip, we've seen a more complicated and nuanced picture of the various tactics that women took to gain the right to vote. We see names and faces beyond just Alice Paul, an imagery that begins to humanize the movement and make it a more engaging experience for students. Next slide, please. So as we continue to answer our essential question, how did women gain the right to vote? Let's take another few moments to look at the final image of our gallery walk tonight. As these primary sources provide a window into multiple perspectives, the women's suffrage movement was splintered, both tactics and divided by race. Increasingly, women of color found themselves at odds with the white leaders of the mainstream suffrage movement, so they continued to use other avenues, such as their church communities, as an organizing base to develop ideas about women's rights. The club movement began to help African American women see one another as political beings, became another foundation. In cities like Chicago, African American women embraced party politics and allied themselves with party operatives. They used their influence and ability to vote at the state level, even before 1920, to affect the question of women's suffrage nationally. And they helped to expand women's rights beyond suffrage, including access to higher education and financial independence. And Native American women leaders engaged in activism for voting rights and ultimately helped to achieve the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. So by using a gallery walk of images, our story of how women gain the right to vote starts simple, but becomes more nuanced and multi-layered, enriching our student understanding of history. Next slide, please. So if you liked the short media montage that you had seen, I invite you all to look at She Resisted, Strategies of Suffrage on PBS Learning Media. We have a complete interactive with extensive primary source material, along with multiple teacher supports on how to incorporate these strategies further into your classroom. So now I'll turn it over back to my colleague Sue, who will give you an overview of our new U.S. history collection.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. Great. Before we finish up and I turn things back to Carolyn, I do want to just let you all know that we have been working very hard on creating a new U.S. history collection on PBS Learning Media. And let's go to the next slide, please. This will be a curated collection of resources. When it's fully built out, we'll have close to 400 resources in the collection. And it's designed to support a U.S. history survey course. It will cover the entire scope and sequence of U.S. history, and where the media allows us, highlight multiple perspectives and underrepresented voices and stories. The collection will be completed this fall, just in time for back to school, and it will include GBH resources drawn primarily from American experience and frontline films, resources from other PBS stations across the country, and brand new interactive resources, including interactive images and image activators. And we will be adding some of the images shared with you this evening as interactive images in this new collection. Next slide, please. Our broad goals for this collection are, we want to be a one-stop shop for U.S. history teachers. These are, we're designing supplemental media resources, so we believe that they're very easy and sort of efficient to integrate into your existing lessons and unit plans. We want to challenge and broaden students, not only with the content, but with our integration of historical thinking skills. And we want to support historically marginalized students to see themselves as part of U.S. history. And we do this by emphasizing diverse narratives and untold stories. Next slide, please. In the collection, you will be able to search by keyword, of course, person, event, topic. You'll be able to browse through any one of these 16 eras, or you can browse by one of 9 historical thinking skills. These were adapted from the C3 framework. And one of those, of course, is analyzing multiple perspectives. Next slide, please. We want teachers to have a consistent experience when they come to the U.S. history collection. And one of the ways we've endeavored to provide that is to create new support materials for teachers and students that follow the same format and content guidelines. So for teachers, every resource in the collection will be accompanied by teaching tips. This is our way of helping you integrate the resource easily into your classroom. So we provide essential and supporting questions. We provide before, while, after viewing questions. If you want to take it further and make it into a full lesson, we have suggestions for how you can do that. And of course, we identify historical thinking skills that are relevant to that resource. For students, on the student-facing shelf, we provide, in many cases, not all cases, but many cases, student background readings, which have been structured to really support student readers. So we have an essential question, we have subheadings, we provide vocabulary, 1 to 2 images that help them understand the content. We provide discussion questions based on the media. These are 3 to 5 higher order critical thinking questions that you might assign for homework or group work in class. And then we are developing independent student activities. These were really crafted during at-home learning, when teachers really wanted to just be able to have something to assign to students at home. And so these are structured very clearly so that they really don't require teacher input or guidance. And each activity focuses on one historical thinking skill that is relevant for that resource. So we're really excited about this collection. I hope that you will come back towards the end of the summer when it's more fully built out, but some of it is available now, so you can get a taste of what we're building. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn things back to Carolyn now.
And thank you, Sue. Yes, the new U.S. History Collection is a wonderful project that we're working on, and will be at the forefront of our presence at NCSS in the winter. But before that, we will be launching it through a whole variety of means in the back to school season. All right, we're winding down. I just have a couple of final remarks, and I'm going to invite Ashante to come back on in a minute and give you a little more information about NCSS. This is just an idea for you to kind of motivate you to explore more of PBS Learning Media. So these are collection banners of resources on PBS Learning Media. And a collection is a type of resource. We consider it a type. You can actually search by collection. And a collection is a curated group of resources that fall under a similar topic or branding or whatever. So for example, the Great War is drawn from the American Experience production of the Great War and a collection of resources there. And Life During World War II is the collection that I mentioned at the top of the program that Sue Wilkins was involved in when she was a director of the World War II Museum. You Stand Up is a brand new collection. It's a multimedia digital civic action curriculum designed to inspire, equip, and empower middle school students to become change makers. And it includes video profiles of young activists, which are just fabulous. So You Stand Up is a production of GBH on Learning Media. All of these are available on Learning Media. We are very excited. The date is almost confirmed. Her appearance is confirmed, but the date is a little bit tentative. We're hoping for June 23rd to have Lori Halsey Anderson with us, the author of Chains, which is the first in a trilogy. We will be interviewing her. The social studies team will be interviewing her, and we'll also be including students in this session who will talk about their reaction to the book. And Lori will answer some questions about the history that is behind her story, and also how she sees that teachers could use her books in their classroom. So we're very excited about that, and you'll get more information about that as we finalize the registration link, etc. All right, Ashante, do you want to come back on and tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I just want to start off just by thanking our presenters. It was a wonderful presentation. I had no doubt it was going to be wonderful, but it was absolutely stellar. So thank you all so much. I also want to thank our attendees for coming this evening and being so active in the chat that made it so much more robust than it already was. So just in terms of NCSS, this is a great time to kind of talk about primary sources because that's what this presentation was about. We are partnering with the Library of Congress to develop a whole bunch of digital resources for teacher candidates, programming and methods professors, but it's also a great resource for in-class room teachers. We have a webinar that's coming up on Thursday using historical books to increase literacy skill through primary sources. And I also want to note our Summer Institute that's going to be taking place in Minneapolis. And these are all free resources for you all. So I've dropped in the chat the link directly to that page. And just know that the C3 framework, because I saw some people mention it and Alicia mentioned it at the beginning, as well as Sue mentioned it in terms of the US History Collection that's coming up. It's also a free resource for you all to go in and use if you just click on the link that's on the resource page that Angelica has been sharing out. You will be able to access the PDF of that.
And then, of course, we want you to plan to come to Philadelphia in December, if at all possible. GBH will be there. We'll have a booth in the exhibit hall and hopefully several sessions also. Our research department at GBH offers a survey. We pay very close attention to the feedback that you give us in the survey. So please complete the survey if you can. And you can download a certificate of acknowledging your participation tonight after the survey if you would like. We keep it open for a week and then we look carefully at the results and again, try and do better. All right, I want to thank our presenters and all of you for all that you do in classrooms all across the country. If the presenters would like to come back on camera, we'll entertain some questions. This is my email, Carolyn_Jacobs@wgbh.org. You are welcome to email me with any questions or comments. I will get the questions to the right person if I'm not the right person. And I'm going to rely on the presenters or Angelica to see if there are any questions that have been posted, but I thought we'd get started with a question that was offered ahead on the registration form. And anyone is welcome to answer this. How can we get students to slow down and draw the most meaning and information from an image?
Lindsay, you want to start that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Sorry, I couldn't hit unmute fast enough. So one of the things that I always remind students is in history, there is no right answer. You know, we're not trying to race through information to get a yes or no question. And that is why I walked you through the activity that I did, which was to really say, just focus on the actual moment. And I think when students start to get lost in the image, they're more willing to deal with that ambiguity. They're more willing to slow down. And the more continued practice that you do this in your classroom, the more willing they are to go along with you. So I would say be patient with yourself, keep iterating to them, just tell me what you see, and it will come. So that's the best advice I can give.
Yeah, and I would just pick up on one thing you mentioned too there, which is that this is a skill that students have to practice and develop. And you know, when you first start this with students, it's really important that you kind of take the lead and model for them because it doesn't actually come, I think, naturally to them. So just as you develop skills in other areas, this is one more to add to the already very long list.
Were there any questions in the chat? Either Angelica, you could help us, or if any of the presenters have noticed. If not, we have many other questions from the that were posted in the registration. And then we'll wind down in just a couple of minutes. Are there any templates that you recommend to assess multiple perspectives in primary sources?
Well, I think, when we were talking about this, we almost thought about this in sort of two phases. That there's sort of this basic or visual analysis that you do first, and then you layer on these very intentional questions that Alicia mentioned at the very beginning to get at multiple perspectives. So I think that the templates for the visual analysis part, I would say the See, Think, Wonder setup works very well. I'm sure a lot of these participants are already familiar with that the library, both the Library of Congress and National Archives, both offer teachers sets of visual analysis worksheets. I think National Archives even has them by grade level. So I'm always a proponent of not reinventing the wheel if you don't have to. So I really would recommend going there and using those kinds of worksheets. But then you have to sort of layer in that multiple perspectives piece. And hopefully we've given you some ideas tonight about how to do that.
I would also like to add that so many people, I remember in the very beginning, you had the See, Think, Wonder activity. I love using that, but I think one of the things we could also do to elevate it, I like to add, make a prediction. So what do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder about how the picture ties in with your essential question? What do you predict this picture is going to show you about the essential question? And then leave an activity for what you learned. So after you teach them whatever material you're going to get into, whether it's a reading primary source or lecture, that helps to explain what that source is about, give them some context, some content knowledge. The next thing is give students an opportunity to revisit an image. And now, what have you learned? How can you reevaluate that image based upon what you've given them in class?
Great. Okay, I think we're going to call it a night. Again, I want to thank the social studies team at GBH and Ashante for joining us, and for NCSS with our collaboration. And again, all of you for all of the work that you do with your students and the willingness to come on yet another Zoom webinar in the evening. Hats off to you. You will get the recording link along with other links to everything in that follow-up email tomorrow. We wish you well and hope to see you on a future event. Thank you. We'll keep the chat open for just a minute or two. Thank you very much.